Good evening. How's everybody doing? Great to be learning with you on a Monday, Yom Sheni. Let's light up the darkness. Okay. Hold on. Just have to make a little bit of an adjustment here with the computer. Whoops. Oh boy. Okay. Hold on. My apologies. Here we go. Okay. Who's in the house? Stephen in New Hampshire, Sharon in New Jersey, Karen in Northern California, John in Maine, Melissa in Great Neck, Shandor in the Bronx, Bella in Florida, Joe in the Inland Empire, Bill in Mid-Missouri, Belle in Texas, Tom in PA, Guy in Ohio, Aoife in Florida, Ella in Southern California, Alan in New York City, Marjorie in Georgia, Chaim in Florida. Welcome, everybody. With God's help, we're going to complete chapter 8 today. We're picking this up about halfway down, page 138b, finishing our discussion of Mishna number 10 here in chapter 8. The sages taught, if there was a person on his deathbed who said, I have 100 dinars owed to me by so-and-so. So on his deathbed, he's revealing that somebody owes him money. And he's telling his heirs, make sure you collect that debt that's owed to me. Now it goes to you. So he says, on his deathbed, I have 100 dinars that are owed to me by so-and-so. The witnesses that hear this may write his statement in a document, even if they do not know whether the statement is true. They're recording what the man said on his deathbed. Therefore, when the person's heir collects the debt, he must bring proof of the debt, as the document written by these witnesses is not regarded as proof. This is the statement of Rabbi Meir. The person on his deathbed, he's not well. Maybe he's misremembering. Maybe he remembers that somebody owes him money, and he thought that it had already been collected, and that he hadn't collected it yet, when in fact he had collected it. So that's not proof that there is a debt and that the debt is outstanding, but it is proof that this man said so on his deathbed. The rabbis say that the witnesses may not write such a document unless they know for a fact that the statement is true. Let's say they went and confirmed so-and-so is on his deathbed and he says that you owe him 100 dinars. Is it true? Yes, it's true. I owe him 100 dinars. Then they write it down. Therefore, when the heirs, the heirs of this person who died, come to collect the debt from the person who owed money to their father, so the heir need not bring proof other than the document written by the witnesses, as this, under the ruling of the rabbis, such a document has the status of a promissory note, presumably because the witnesses to the deathbed statement also investigated and are acting like a court and authenticating that the debt exists. Rav Nachman says that Rav Huna told me that the opposite is taught in another baraisa. Rabbi Meir says that the witnesses may not write his statement in a document they know for a fact, unless they know for a fact that the statement is true. And the rabbis say that they may write it even if they do not know whether the statement is true. And even Rabbi Meir said that they may not write it only due to the concern that it might be presented before a court that makes a mistake and allows the heirs to collect without furnishing additional proof. Rav Dimi of Nehardea says the halacha is, that there is no concern about the possibility of a court that will make a mistake. So presumably we would write down this statement of the man on his deathbed about money that he is owed. And the Gemara asks, in what way is this case different from Rava's statement? As Rava says, a court may not supervise chalitza, right? Chalitza, we've talked about a lot recently, the ceremony by which a widow of a man who died without children but who left a brother and a widow. So the widow and the brother can marry, that's yibum, and their first child would be the heir of the man who died without children. Or they can choose not to marry. If they choose not to marry, they perform the chalitza ceremony, and then she no longer has a yibum obligation, and she can go marry whoever she wants. So says Rava, a court may not supervise chalitza unless the judges recognize the yavam and the yavama, the widow and the brother of the man who died. And a court may not supervise a declaration of the refusal of a girl upon her reaching majority to remain married to the man whom her mother or brothers married her to as a minor after the death of her father, unless the court recognizes this girl. Therefore, another court may write a document attesting to the performance of chalitza, or a document stating that a declaration of refusal was made in a court elsewhere, based on the testimony of witnesses, even if the judges do not recognize these people, relying on the presumption the first court would not have allowed the act to be performed had they not been sure of the identities of the parties. And what is the reason that Rava said that the court must recognize the participants in these actions? Is it not due to the concern that a court that errs, right, a court that makes mistakes, might write such a document based on the testimony of witnesses without verifying the participating parties were recognized by the court where the chalitza or the refusal took place? And the Gemara answers, the two issues are not the same. A court does not normally examine the act of another court, so there is concern that the court where the document is written might assume that the court where the act took place recognized the participating parties. But a court does not normally examine the statement of witnesses. Therefore, there is no concern that it will rely on a statement written by witnesses without their knowledge of its accuracy. And that concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 10. Now, Mishnah number 11. In continuation of the case discussed in the previous Mishnah of a father who wrote a document granting his property to his son, but he reserved the rights to the produce during his lifetime. Right? So the father owns a field, and he says to his son, I want you to have it, I'm gifting it to you, but I'm going to keep it for as long as I'm alive, to farm it, to harvest it, bring in the proceeds, live off the proceeds from this field. But upon my death, not only will you own the field, you will also have the right to farm it, because the right to farm it is something I'm keeping only for the rest of my life. Right? That's the arrangement the father created with his son. So the son didn't inherit the field. It was gifted to him. But the father reserved the right to use the field as long as he's alive. Okay. So about this arrangement, the Mishnah states that the father may detach produce from the land and feed the produce to whomever he wishes. I mean, he retained the right to harvest the produce from that land. He can do anything he wants with it. And what he left detached at the time of his death belongs to all the father's heirs and not only to his son. In other words, if he harvested that field, right? And so he brought in the big crop, and let's say it's an incredible bumper crop, and it's all piled up right next to the field, all the wheat that he harvested from that field, and then he drops dead. Now the produce of that field, the right to farm that field and the produce from it goes to the son as soon as the father died. But that produce that the father already harvested before he died, what's detached from the ground, so that just goes into the estate of the father. and however that estate is going to be disposed of through the laws of inheritance is where that produce goes. It is no longer part of that field, and that's why the son who already received the ownership of that field and now has the right to farm it, he doesn't get produce that was detached from it during the father's life. That's Mishnah number 11. Now the Gemara. The Mishnah indicates that what the father left detached, yes, it is inherited by all the heirs. But the produce that is still connected to the ground at the time of his death, no. It is not inherited by the rest of the heirs. Rather, it belongs to the son who received the property as a gift. Now we're on page 139a. But isn't it taught in a baraisa, in the Tosefta of Tractate Kesuvos 8.5, that in a similar case, the court appraises the produce that is still connected to the ground for the purchaser of the land, who must pay the seller's heirs for it. So accordingly, the connected produce also belongs to the heirs. Ula said, no, you misunderstand. This is not difficult. Here in the Mishnah, the law is stated with regard to his son, who receives the connected produce after the father's death. There in the Baraisa, the law is stated with regard to another person who purchased the land from the son. Since a person's disposition is favorable toward his son, the father certainly intended to bequeath the connected produce to his son together with the property itself. When the son sold it to another person, there was no such intention. And that short Gemara concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 11. Now, Mishnah number 12, the final Mishnah of this chapter. If a person died and left adult and minor sons, right? He left several sons, and some were already adults and some were still minors. So the adults are not provided for by using the funds of the minors, and the minors are not sustained, i.e. they do not receive food, by using funds of the adults. Rather, they each receive a share of the inheritance equally, and each son sees to his needs from his own shares, right? Once the estate is divided among the sons, okay, so anything that they need, they take from their share, whether they're an adult or a minor. Adult sons don't have an obligation to sustain minors from their own portion when those minors have a portion of their own. Now, if the adults married, the minors marry. This is not clear on its face at all, and the Gemara will explain that when we get to it. But if the minors say, we are marrying in the same manner that you adults married during our father's lifetime, the court does not listen to them. Rather, whatever their father gave the adults in his lifetime, he gave them, and the minors do not have the right to receive more than their share of the inheritance. This will be explained in the Gemara. And similarly, if the father left adult and minor daughters, but no sons, in which case the daughters inherit the estate, so the adult daughters are not provided for by using funds of the minor daughters, and the minor daughters are not sustained by using funds of the adult daughters. Rather, they receive a share of the inheritance equally, and each daughter sees to her own needs from her share. If the adult daughters married, the minor daughters marry, as the Gemara will explain. But if the minors say, we are marrying in the same manner that you adults married during our father's lifetime, the court does not listen to them. So this following halacha, this law, is a stringency with regard to a daughter's inheritance vis-a-vis the son's inheritance. To wit, the halacha is that the daughters are sustained by using funds of the sons, as stipulated in their mother's marriage contract. But they're not sustained by using funds of the other daughters, right? Sons inherit, daughters don't, when there are sons and daughters. So the sons do bear a responsibility to sustain their sisters from their inheritance. But where there are only sons or where there are only daughters, each looks to his own share for sustenance. And in terms of this thing about marrying, just very simple. Let's say there were 4 daughters, right? And 2 of them are adult daughters who got married during their father's lifetime. And the father paid for their weddings. Then the father dies. And, he has an estate which he leaves to the 4 daughters that they split 4 ways. So now come the minor daughters, and it's time for them to get, who were minors at the time that their father died, and it's time for them to get married. And they say, hey, well, you older sisters, dad paid for your wedding. I want the estate to pay for my wedding. Answer, no. You get your own share of the inheritance, and you can pay for your wedding out of that. Because, of course, when dad was alive, he could make decisions on whether to pay for a wedding or not, how much to pay. He also had the possibility of earning more money because he's alive. But after his death, the estate is finite, right? It's not like he's going to earn more now that he's dead. And you can't look to the estate to provide for you what your father provided for your sisters while he was alive, because he's no longer alive, sadly. That's the Mishnah. Now the Gemara. Rava says, with regard to this eldest of the brothers who wears garments and covers himself from the common property of the house, what he did is done, and the other brothers cannot subtract from his share of the inheritance as a result. So we just said that, they're all going to take what they need from their own share of the inheritance, not from the undivided estate before it gets divided. But here's an exception. The oldest brother can take funds from the estate for his own clothing. And why would that be an exception? So the Gemara asks, but didn't we learn in the Mishnah that the adults are not provided for by using funds of the minors? And the Gemara answers, the Mishnah is referring to an unemployed person, whereas Rava, who says that the oldest son can take money from the undivided estate for his own clothing. Why? Rava was referring to the brother who handles the finances of the entire family. Therefore, it is in the interest of all the brothers for him to wear appropriate attire so that he can do business on behalf of the estate and protect everybody's investments, protect the estate on behalf of all his brothers. And the Gemara asks if the Mishnah is referring to an unemployed person, meaning that you can't take from the undivided estate, only from your own share. Isn't it obvious that he may not take from the common inheritance of all the brothers? And the Gemara answers, well, lest you say that it is preferable for them that he dress appropriately so that he will not be repulsive, thereby dishonoring the family name, the Mishnah teaches us that nonetheless he does not have the right to take money for clothing from the common inheritance, and if he does so, the brothers can subtract from his share of the inheritance as a result of this money that he took from the common pool of the inheritance. Now, the Mishnah taught that if the adults married, the minors married. And the Gemara asks, what is it saying? What does this mean? Rav Yehuda says that this is what it is saying. If the adults married after their father's death and used the common inheritance to pay for their weddings, then the minors that marry after their father's death may also pay for their weddings from the common inheritance. They shouldn't have done it, but the adults were in a position to just use those funds, and if they did, then the minors can do the same thing. But if the adults married during their father's lifetime, and then the minors come and say after their father's death that we will marry in the same manner that you, the adults, married during father's lifetime, the court does not listen to them. Rather, whatever sum their father gave the adults to pay for their weddings while he was alive, he gave to them. And the minors do not have the right to demand that the same sum be taken from the estate or from the inheritance for themselves. Now, the Mishnah teaches that if the father left adult and minor daughters and the adults married, the minors marry. Avu Bar Geneva sent a question to Rava. Our teacher, instruct us. If a woman borrowed money and consumed it, meaning she borrowed money and she spent it, right? So she doesn't have the money and she's not an earner, so she doesn't have what to pay back the loan. And then before she repaid that debt, she arose and got married, bringing any property that she does have into the marriage. Then what is the law? Is the husband considered a purchaser of her property, or is he considered an heir to her property? So it's even that she has, property from which she could have repaid that loan, but she didn't, right? She brought some property into the marriage. She left an outstanding loan from when she was single, And now that she's married, her property is now, under the auspices of her husband. So the question is, can this person who lent money to a single woman, now that she's married, go to her husband and say, hey, I lent money to your wife when she was single. You owe me the amount that I lent to her. Can he collect from the husband? That's what's being asked. On the one hand, you could say, well, the husband never borrowed this money, and whatever happened before he got married. So why should he have to make good on the loan? Certainly not from his own property. But she had property that she could have used to pay back the loan that she brought into the marriage, and the husband now has control of that property. So can't the creditor say, well, pay me from the property that your wife brought into your marriage? She should have used that property to pay me back. And it seems that the answer is going to depend on whether the husband is considered a purchaser, and this loan that the person who lent money to the woman, I'm not sure exactly why, but there is no promissory note. We know there's no promissory note, so we're going to assume it was an oral loan, a contract, right, made orally for that loan. So if, you lend money to somebody and they're supposed to pay you back, and what you would have used as collateral is a field that then they sold to a purchaser, well, without a promissory note, you don't have a lien. So you can't go chase that money, that property that the person you lent money to, what he should have used to pay you back, he sold. Now you can't go and take that property out of the hands of the purchaser because there was no lien on it. There is no promissory note. And if the husband is considered like a purchaser with respect to the property that a wife brings into the marriage, then this creditor is not going to be able to get at it. On the other hand, if a husband is considered like an inheritor of the property that his wife brings into a marriage, then perhaps this creditor could remove that property from the domain of the husband. So the halachic ramifications of this dilemma is like this. Is the husband considered a purchaser, and the creditor therefore cannot collect his wife's premarital debt from him, as one does not collect from the purchasers a loan by oral agreement? Or perhaps the husband is considered to be an heir of his wife with regard to the property she brings into the marriage, and the creditor can collect from the heirs a loan by oral agreement. Rava said to him, we learn the answer to this question in the Mishna. If the adult daughter is married, the minor daughters marry. And what is it not teaching that the adult daughters married, each one of them transferring money from the common inheritance to her husband to cover the wedding expenses? The minor daughters also marry, paying for the wedding from the money that each elder sister transferred to her husband. So clearly, although the money that the elder daughters took from the inheritance for their weddings has the status of a loan by oral agreement, their husbands are liable to return it. And this proves that the husbands are considered heirs. Like, that needs a little unpacking, right? I mean, they're saying that, if these daughters, these adult daughters who inherited an estate, that if they used part of that estate to pay for their wedding, that's considered as if the money that was used to pay for their wedding is money that they gave to their husband, and then the husband used to pay for the wedding. And it shouldn't have gone to the husband, and therefore the minor daughters can now go pursue that money, even though it's already been spent, obviously on the wedding supplies, etc. Nevertheless, it was money that the husband would have had to spend of his own money had his new wife not used the father's estate for it in an unauthorized manner. Therefore, the husband is liable for it, and the minor daughters, right, the sisters, the younger sisters of the older daughters, who used that money to pay for their wedding, they can now, the younger sisters can go to their brothers-in-law, right, to their older sister's husband, and say, hey, you shouldn't have used that money. The fact that you used it means that now you owe it to me so I can get married in the same style that my sister did. Complicated argument, and in fact, the Gemara says, no, that doesn't work. The Mishna is teaching that if the adults married, and the adult sisters, and each one transferred money to her husband, The minors also marry, and each one may transfer money from the common inheritance to her own husband for the wedding expenses. They cannot collect money from what was already transferred by their sisters to their husbands. In other words, if the older sisters took money out of the common inheritance pool, out of the undivided inheritance funds for their weddings, then the younger sisters can do the same. It's not that they're going to go to the husbands of their older sisters and say, you owe us and you have to pay for our wedding. And the Gemara says, oh really? Is that so? But didn't Rabbi Chia teach that if the adults married and transferred money to their husbands, the minors marry and collect money from the husband of the older sisters, not from the undivided estate. So the Gemara answers, even according to this interpretation, there is no proof from the Mishnah with regard to the case of a loan by oral agreement. Perhaps the provision of wedding expenses for the daughters is different as it generates publicity, since it is well known that a specific portion of a person's estate is lien to the future wedding expenses of his single daughters. It has the status of a loan with a promissory note. Therefore, the younger daughters can collect from the husbands of the elder daughters, even if the status of the husbands is that of purchasers. Rav Papa said to Rava, is this not identical to the law that Ravin sent in his letter from Eretz Yisrael? The law states that with regard to one who died and left a widow and a daughter, so his widow is sustained from his property. If the daughter then married, the widow is still sustained from his property, although it is now in the possession of the daughter's husband, as the daughter inherited the property from her father because there were no sons. With regard to a case where the daughter then died, right? So you got the picture. There was a man, he had a wife and he had a daughter. The man dies. His estate goes to his daughter, not to his wife. It goes to his daughter. And it goes to his daughter because he doesn't have sons. If he had a son, it would go to the son. And then the son would have an obligation to take care of his mom, the man's widow. Since there's no son, it goes to the daughter. And the daughter has an obligation to take care of her mom, who is the widow of the original man. Now the daughter marries, right? So she brings property into the marriage with her new husband. But she also brings along with that property that she inherited from her father, the obligation to sustain her mom. So the widow keeps getting sustained from the property of the estate, which now passed to the daughter and which is now controlled by her husband. But that husband has an obligation to support his mother-in-law. And then, if the daughter of the original man who died, if that daughter dies, so now the man's estate, right, is in the possession of the son-in-law maybe he never met. And that son-in-law now has an obligation to sustain his mother-in-law, the original widow of the man who died. Right? If the daughter then married, the widow is still sustained from the original property, although it is now in the possession of the daughter's husband, as she had inherited the property from her father. Now, with regard to a case where the daughter then died and her husband inherited from her, Rav Yehuda, the son of the sister of Rabbi Yosef ben Chanina, says, this incident occurred with me. And the sages said that the late man's widow is still sustained from his property, although it is now fully owned by his daughter's husband. And Rav Papa explains, granted, if you say the husband is considered an heir, it is due to that reason that his father-in-law's widow is still sustained from his property. It is still liened to her sustenance. But if you say that a husband is considered like a purchaser of his wife's property, then why is his father-in-law's widow sustained from his property? The purchasers of inherited property are not obligated to sustain the widow. It must be that a husband is deemed like an inheritor of his wife's property. Abaye said, if Ravin had not sent this letter, would we not have known that the husband has the status of a purchaser? But didn't we learn in the Mishnah, Tractate Bechoros 52b, these properties do not return to the original owners in the Jubilee year, the Yovel, from Leviticus 25, verses 13 through 24, the portion of the firstborn, right? Remember, if you sell a field in ancient Israel, when the temple is standing and the Jubilee year is being observed every 50 years, so if you sell a field, an ancestral field, right, that you're one of the families that receive property, when Joshua led the children of Israel into the promised land. And then that property was passed down through the generations in your family. Okay, so that's your ancestral holding. If you sell that field, you're not selling that field forever. You're selling that field so that somebody has the right to use it for as many years as remain until the next Jubilee year. And in every Yovel, in every Jubilee year, which is every 50 years, all such sales are unwound and they go back to the family holdings of the ancestral division of property. However, the status of those fields, the ownership of the fields, did change somewhat over time because there are certain transfers of these ancestral holdings that do not revert in the Jubilee year. For example, the double portion of the firstborn, right? So there was a man, he had, a field, and he divided it among his sons. So the firstborn gets a double portion. When the Jubilee year comes, he doesn't give back his extra portion to his brothers because it's the double portion of the firstborn. And now we're on page 139b. And one who inherits the property of his wife after her death, i.e. the property is not returned to her family, right? So if she inherited it because she had no brothers and her father's field went to her, and then she married her husband and then she died and her husband inherited from her, that field is now part of the husband's family, not the wife's family where it came from. And it doesn't revert in the Jubilee year. Rava said to him, and now that Ravin sent the letter, do we in fact know that the husband has the status of an heir? Doesn't Rabbi Yosef, the son of Rabbi Hanina, say, in Usha, they instituted an ordinance that in the case of a woman who sold her usufruct property, right, i.e. property that she alone owns, and that her husband benefits only from the profits while they're married, and she sold it during her husband's lifetime, and then she died, so the husband repossesses it from the purchasers. Apparently, the husband's status is that of a purchaser, as a purchaser can appropriate his purchase from a later purchaser, whereas an heir does not inherit property that the person sold before he died. So rather, Rav Ashi says that the sages equated the husband with an heir, and the sages equated him with a purchaser. Right? In other words, why are we calling him a purchaser or an heir? We're saying he's a husband, right? So, but with regard to the property of his wife that he has control over while she's alive, and then when she dies, he gets it. But does he get it because he, in a sense, purchased his wife? Right, in the sense that he had to sign a contract, he didn't. He might have to provide it. Well, usually her father provided a dowry to her husband, but he also owes her money. Right, he signed an obligation in the ketubah that if he dies before her or if he divorces her, he owes her money, and in return, she gets sort of like he has control over her property, and he also has to sustain her. So, are we going to say that as a matter, forget morals here, forget the way it emotionally sounds. The question is, how is he going to be treated under the law when she dies? Does he inherit her property, or does it pass to him under the laws of purchase and sale? And the answer is, it could be a little bit of both, right? So the sages equated a husband with an heir, and the sages equated him with a purchaser. And they deemed him as whichever is better for him, based on the circumstances of the case. So with regard to the Jubilee year, the sages equated him with an heir, due to his potential loss were he to be equated with a purchaser, as he would be obligated to return the property to his wife's heirs. And with regard to the case of Rabbi Yosef, the son of Rabbi Hanina, where the wife sold the property, the sages equated him with a purchaser, due to his potential loss were he to be equated with an heir. So with regard to Ravin's halacha, concerning the sustenance of the husband's father-in-law's widow, due to the potential loss of the widow, the sages equated him with an heir, meaning he has to take care of his mother-in-law, right? Even though her husband died and his wife died, he still has to take care of that widow. I'm almost done. Questions or comments, please get them in now. Okay, the Gemara asks, but with regard to the case of Rabbi Yosef, the son of Rabbi Hanina, there is a loss to the purchasers from whom the husband appropriates the property, and nevertheless, the sages equated him with a purchaser. And the Gemara answers, well, there, the purchasers caused their own loss. Since they knew that there is a husband, they should not have purchased the property from a wife living under the authority of her husband, removing it from the husband and his heirs, right? In other words, she brought a field into the marriage. So now the husband is working it and, doing all the work on that field and harvesting it and using that food and produce to feed the family, right? Now, the field is hers so that if the husband dies and and she's a widow, or they divorce and she leaves the marriage as a divorcee, that field that she brought into the marriage, she takes with her out of the marriage. So it's her field. But the husband has the right to farm it and to its proceeds while they're married. So what she owns is the underlying right to the field, which would become important, right, if she becomes a widow or a divorcee. What if she sells that field? So what is she selling? She's selling the right to receive the field if she gets divorced or widowed from that marriage. But if she dies first, then what she sold is meaningless, because the husband gets that field. He inherits it from the wife, and he can even take it. If she sold it to someone, they're out of luck. He can take the field out from that purchaser, and that purchaser should have known better than to purchase a field from a wife who is married, right? Because they're not going to end up with it, because that's the law. So that's what I've got for us today. Just one question from Sharon. How did these sisters gain access to funds that was in the inheritance funds that was not explicitly theirs? I think what it might be is that, so the father died. There were only daughters. So let's say there's 3 of them. One is a minor, 2 are adults. And the 2 who are adults now get the bank account, right? And so what they say is, okay, well, we definitely need to divide up the assets, but it's not so simple. There's a bank account, there's a stock account, there's some rental property. We're not sure where all the property is. We're not really sure how, whether we should sell it or keep collecting rent. It's complicated. In the meantime, we're getting married. So let's just make a withdrawal just for that purpose. Right? So the estate, before it gets divided, it might take some time to divide up the estate. And in that period before it's divided, that's when these adult daughters took some of the money out. If they paid for their weddings with it, then the younger daughters get to do the same thing. But really, none of them should have done that. Joseph says, can children of a man on his deathbed, or not even sick yet, but has a will, request a gift before he ratifies the will? I think, are you asking me, is it just considered inappropriate for a son or daughter to request something of the parent? Because, certainly they can ask for whatever they want. Kids ask their parents stuff all the time, whether they're minors or adults. And then the father or the mother, can decide whether to grant that request or not. So there's nothing, I don't think there's anything halakhically wrong with asking. And then the question is what the guy says. Now, that request, if it's a person on the deathbed, he says, can you give me, the Rolex, right? And the father nods. And based on that, he takes the Rolex, right? So maybe the other siblings might say, or a witness might say, yeah, it wasn't clear to us that he was saying yes when you said, can I have the Rolex? Maybe he was just ill and it was a barely perceptible movement. Maybe he was just thirsty. Maybe he was clearing his throat. So it might be just a point of evidence, in a litigation that requires further investigation. I'm not sure if I've answered your question or not, but hopefully. And Tom says, yes, thanks, Salanina. I'm going through some personal uncertainty and anxiety at the moment. And the nightly AT class is greatly comforting to be with my fellow Yehudim and Bill. Beautiful. That's what I've got for us tonight. And with God's help, we'll all be together tomorrow, Tuesday at the regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific. Have a great night.